Okay, in the previous videos, we created two Simulink diagrams. So we first created a powertrain Simulink diagram to represent the powertrain or architecture of our vehicle, in which we have a driver, an engine, a transmission, a driveline, and a chassis. And then we went through and we annotated the buses. So we put the bus name on each line, the type as being bus, and then if it appears in the user interface or not when the powertrain is being drawn. You want to make sure you annotate each of the lines. Just to mention, I think at the very end of the prior video where this architecture was developed, there was still an annotation that needed to be put onto the output line here. So bus name is system info bus, type is bus, GUI visible is false. And then the other architecture is the very top level. So what's being done here is the signals are being aggregated, fed out, and then they're being wrapped around and fed back in. So to do that, we have a top level architecture block here. And one thing I probably should do is just add a unit delay in this bus that's being fed around. So this is the system info bus that's being sent back around and then coming in. So let me just add, if I type memory here, we could add a unit delay. I'll do Control R to rotate it, and I'll put it here. So that introduces a unit delay into the system. So let me save that. So we have these two architecture files. One is the top level of the vehicle, and then the other one is the architecture that fits inside that block. So what we want to do is we want to have those files loadable in Edit a Vehicle. So if I go to Amber and select the Autonomy Workflow Edit a Vehicle, what we'd like to be able to do is have those files appear in the selection tree. So to do that, the top level needs to be imported as a vehicle template. So we could do that here by doing using the API as an example for some variation. We could use IntelliSense by hitting tab. There's this capture vehicle. So for the top level architecture, the top level becomes selectable in the user interface. So we want to generate an A vehicle file from it. So I'll pass in the name of the SLX file, hit enter. Now I'll go through the process of importing it and generating the A vehicle file for it. And then we will then do a configuration capture, which is the other option here, on our architecture powertrain. So we'll generate an A config file for this architecture. So we pass it in and hit enter, and it'll go through and capture that architecture. So it creates a few files when it's doing the capture. If it's just a capture configuration, it'll generate an A config file, which has the subsystem information and connections between it. Then there's an A layout file, which is also generated, which helps to define what type of connections they are, if there are any blocks. So because I added that memory block to one of the buses, that information would be stored in the A layout file. So the A config just simplifies the architecture to make it easy to draw with the essential elements that the user interface renders. There's also a JPEG file that's generated in case that we want to add it to reports. And then there's the original architecture file that I did for the importing. And then there's a cached version of that file. So there's a file that's generated that's used if you have the build from diagram selected in the user interface. So when you're doing the runs, there'll be different options that'll be selected here. So use diagrams is what's indicating that when running a simulation, we're actually using the cached version of the diagram and not reconstructing the diagram every time from the A config and A layout. because you can build the diagram. So if I do help and then we do build, you could use the build vehicle for this, and you pass in the configuration file name. What it'll do is it will reconstruct the diagram from the information in the A config and the A layout. So you can see here that it constructed the diagram. There's also an option to rebuild it with annotations. So you could do build with annotations and set that to true, and it will create the diagram with the annotations. So this is convenient if you want to take a config, rebuild it, modify the annotations, and then recapture it. This is just showing how to do it through the API. This is also doable through the user interface. So we have also for the top level architecture, they're the same files that are generated, but then there's also an A vehicle file, which is a file that's selected in the vehicle selection tree in the user interface. So if we go here, let me just close these runs, do edit a vehicle, and select a vehicle. You'll see that the top level architecture is selectable. So I could select that. And then there's a configuration here. And we could select the architecture powertrain and select that. And then you can see the individual components that are in the powertrain. So you can see the chassis, driveline, driver, engine, and transmission. If you go to the graphical view, you can also see the picture for the powertrain. And if you navigate into it, you'll see the different component models. I could then navigate back up to the top level architecture. Then we could also go to the files, back to files here. And what we'll do next is we'll go through and we'll import the model and initialization file for each one of these components.